The billionaire's wife divorced him and left him with 2 boys despite his billionaire status. But Grace, the black maid from Jamaica, made it easy for him. He rewarded the maid with what people least expected. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a courier who wouldn't meet James Wellington's eyes, as if witnessing the collapse of a billionaire's marriage might somehow be contagious. Before I dive deep into this story, please let me know in the comments where you are watching from, like this video and share it with your community, and also subscribe for more beautiful stories like this. James stood in the marble foyer of his Beverly Hills mansion, the legal documents trembling slightly in his hands. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see his twin sons, 8-year-old Michael and Matthew, kicking a soccer ball across the pristine lawn while their nanny supervised from a distance. They had no idea their mother had just legally erased herself from their lives, citing irreconcilable differences and demanding nothing, not alimony, not property, not even shared custody. She doesn't want anything because she never wanted us, James thought, his throat tightening. The realization hit harder than losing half his net worth would have. "Mr. Wellington?" The nanny's voice drifted from the doorway. "The boys are asking when Mommy's coming home from her business trip." James folded the papers, his knuckles white. Tell them it's been extended." 3 weeks later, the nanny quit. Then the replacement. Then the replacement's replacement. Michael had developed a stutter, and Matthew refused to speak at all. The house felt like a mausoleum despite its grandeur, all marble surfaces and echoing silence, with 2 little boys rattling around like ghosts. James found himself working 18-hour days, not from passion but from avoidance. Coming home meant facing the accusation in his son's eyes, the questions he couldn't answer, the dinner table conversations that died before they began. He hired the best child psychologists money could buy, enrolled the boys in exclusive programs, bought them everything they pointed at. Nothing worked. 2,000 miles away, in a cramped apartment above a Miami laundromat, Grace Chambers counted crumpled bills by the light of a flickering fluorescent bulb. $73. Enough for groceries this week, but not enough for her sister's medicine back in Kingston. She pressed her palms against her eyes, fighting the familiar wave of exhaustion. 3 jobs, cleaning houses during the day, stocking shelves at night, and weekend catering gigs still weren't enough. At 32, Grace felt decades older, her once bright dreams reduced to simple survival math: rent, food, remittances to Jamaica, repeat. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Marva. "Grace, the doctors say Mama needs surgery. Soon." Grace stared at the message until the words blurred. She'd already sold everything of value, already worked every hour the day contained. The only option left was the job posting she'd torn from the community center bulletin board, but hadn't dared call about. A live-in housekeeper position in California. Good pay, they said. Very good pay. But live-in meant leaving her small community, the Jamaican families who shared Sunday dinners and looked out for each other. It meant entering another wealthy white family's world, where she'd be expected to remain invisible, efficient, grateful for their generosity in employing her. Grace walked to her tiny kitchen and put the kettle on for tea, a ritual that always transported her home. As steam rose from the spout, she could almost smell her mother's curry and hear her father's laughter from the porch. Both are gone now, along with the family farm lost to drought and debt. Grace was the only one left to carry their memory, to send money to Marva, to somehow build something meaningful from the ashes of everything she'd lost. She pulled out her phone and stared at the California number. Her reflection in the black screen showed tired eyes and worry lines that hadn't been there 5 years ago. But beneath the exhaustion, something else flickered, the same determination that had carried her across an ocean with nothing but hope and 2 suitcases. James sat in his home office at midnight, surrounded by financial reports he couldn't concentrate on. Through the baby monitor, he could hear Matthew crying softly in his sleep, the same heartbroken whimpering that had become the soundtrack of their lives. The sound cut through him like glass. He'd built an empire, revolutionized cloud computing, graced magazine covers as one of America's most eligible bachelors. But he couldn't comfort his own children. He couldn't fill the hole their mother had torn through their family. All his money, all his power, all his connections, useless against the simple, devastating fact that his sons were broken, and he didn't know how to fix them. The staffing agency had called earlier with another candidate. "She's different from the others," the woman had said carefully. "More mature. Has experience with difficult situations." James had almost laughed at the euphemism. Difficult situations. As if his family's collapse was just another logistical challenge to be managed. But tomorrow, this Grace Chambers would arrive, and maybe, just maybe, she'd be different from the parade of nannies who'd fled his house like it was cursed. Maybe she'd see past the wealth and chaos to the simple truth underneath. Two little boys who needed someone to love them, and a father who'd forgotten how. Outside, Beverly Hills sparkled with 1,000 lights, each one representing another perfect life, another intact family. James pressed his forehead against the cool glass and wondered if he'd ever find his way back to something real. Have you ever noticed how money can buy everything except the things that matter most? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Also tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Grace stepped out of the Uber at the end of a winding driveway that seemed to stretch toward the Hollywood Hills themselves. The Wellington estate rose before her like something from a movie, all glass and steel and impossible angles, designed to intimidate rather than welcome. She adjusted the strap of her worn duffel bag and whispered a quick prayer in Patois, the way her grandmother had taught her. The front door opened before she could knock. James Wellington stood there, and Grace's first thought was how different he looked from the confident businessman she'd seen in magazine photos. His hair was disheveled, his expensive shirt wrinkled, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. "Miss Chambers?" His voice was rougher than she'd expected from their phone conversation. "Yes, sir." "Grace." She extended her hand, and when he shook it, she noticed the slight tremor in his fingers. "Please come in. The boys are." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "They're having breakfast. Or trying to." Grace followed him through a foyer that could have housed her entire Miami apartment. Everything was pristine, expensive, cold, like a museum where no one actually lived. But as they approached what must be the kitchen, she heard it. The sound of a child crying and another voice, small and desperate, trying to offer comfort. "Matthew, please eat something. Just one bite." Grace's maternal instincts kicked in before her brain could stop them. She quickened her pace, following the sound of distress. In the kitchen, she found them. Two identical boys with dark hair and their father's green eyes sat at a breakfast bar that could seat 12. One, Michael, she guessed from his slightly more animated expression, was trying to coax his brother to eat scrambled eggs that had long since gone cold. Matthew sat rigid, tears streaming down his cheeks, his small hands clenched in his lap. "Boys," James said, his voice carefully controlled, "this is Miss Chambers. She's going to be helping us for a while." Both boys looked at Grace with the wary expression of children who'd learned not to get attached to the adults who came and went from their lives. But Matthew's tears didn't stop, and something in his silent anguish called to every loss Grace had ever experienced. Without thinking, she approached slowly, the way she'd once approached wounded animals on her family's farm. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she noticed things, the way Matthew's shoulders shook, how Michael's protective instincts made him seem older than his 8 years, the breakfast no one was eating. "You know," Grace said finally, her Jamaican accent soft and melodic in the sterile kitchen, "back home in Jamaica, my grandmother used to say that tears are just the heart's way of washing itself clean." Matthew's crying quieted slightly. Michael looked curious despite himself. Grace moved to the refrigerator, not asking permission, just acting on instinct. But she also said that healing happens better with a full belly. She began pulling out ingredients: eggs, cheese, a red bell pepper that looked lonely in the vast, empty space. "What are you doing?" James asked, uncertainty coloring his voice. "Making breakfast," Grace replied simply. "Real breakfast. Not the kind that gets cold while we worry about eating it." She found a pan, smaller than the intimidating professional-grade equipment that dominated the kitchen, and began to work. As butter sizzled and the scent of cooking food filled the air, she started to hum. Not consciously, but the way her mother had hummed while cooking, the way Jamaican women had hummed while working for generations. "What's that song?" Michael asked quietly. "Just something my mama used to sing. About how every morning is a chance to start fresh, like the sun rising over the Blue Mountains." "Where are the Blue Mountains?" This from Matthew, his first words since she'd arrived. Grace smiled, continuing to scramble the eggs with practiced efficiency. "In Jamaica, where I'm from. They're so beautiful, they make you believe in magic. Green and misty, with the sweetest air you ever breathed." "Is that why you talk differently?" Michael had abandoned his protective stance and moved closer to watch her cook. "Everyone talks differently somewhere, little man. The question is, do you hear the kindness underneath the words?" James stood frozen in the doorway, watching this woman, this stranger, accomplish in 5 minutes what teams of professionals had failed to do in weeks. His sons were talking, not just answering questions, but actually engaging, their eyes bright with curiosity instead of pain. Grace plated the eggs, adding a sprinkle of cheese and a slice of the red pepper cut into the shape of a smile. She set the plates in front of the boys, then looked directly at James. "You hungry too, Mr. Wellington?" Something in her voice, gentle but not deferential, caring but not pitying, made his throat tight. When was the last time someone had asked if he was hungry? Not what he needed for work, not what the company required, not what his schedule demanded. Just, if he was hungry. He cleared his throat. "I usually just have coffee." Grace was already cracking more eggs. "Coffee's good for the mind, but food is good for the soul. And from the look of things, your soul could use some tending." Matthew took a bite of his eggs, then another. Michael followed suit. The kitchen, which had felt like a battleground minutes before, suddenly hummed with the simple rhythm of a family sharing a meal. Grace caught James's eye and smiled, not the practiced smile of an employee, but something real and warm and completely unexpected. In that moment, something shifted in the vast, empty house. Something that felt dangerously like hope. By the third day, James found himself making excuses to work from home. He told himself it was about monitoring the new arrangement, ensuring his sons were properly cared for. But the truth sat heavier in his chest. Grace Chambers had brought something into his house that he didn't know how to name, and it terrified him. She moved through their lives like sunlight through windows that had been sealed shut too long. The boys followed her around like puppies, chattering about everything and nothing. Matthew had stopped crying at night. Michael had started laughing, actual, belly-deep laughter that echoed through rooms that had known only whispers for months. But with each small miracle, James felt himself pulling back, retreating behind the familiar walls of work calls and business obligations. This was temporary, he reminded himself. She was an employee, nothing more. "Mr. Wellington?" Grace appeared in his office doorway, holding a plate of something that smelled like heaven. "The boys are asking if you'll join us for lunch." James didn't look up from his laptop screen. "I'm in the middle of a merger. Just handle whatever they need." He felt rather than saw her stillness, the way she absorbed his dismissal without flinching. When he finally glanced up, she was studying him with those dark, knowing eyes that seemed to see too much. "Of course," she said quietly, setting the plate on his desk. "I made jerk chicken. Thought you might like to taste a piece of Jamaica." After she left, James stared at the food, vibrant and aromatic, nothing like the bland meals the previous staff had prepared. He took a bite and was surprised by the complexity of flavors, the way the spice built slowly, warming him from the inside. It was the first meal he'd actually tasted in months. Through his office window, he could see Grace in the backyard with the boys, teaching them to play a clapping game that had them dissolving into giggles. The sight made his chest ache in ways he didn't want to examine. Grace knew she was in dangerous territory. She'd worked for wealthy families before, understood the invisible boundaries that kept everyone safe and comfortable. But the Wellington family was different, broken in ways that called to every nurturing instinct she possessed. Michael had shown her his mother's abandoned art studio that morning, dust covers draped over canvases like funeral shrouds. "She used to paint us," he'd whispered, "but then she said we were too much work." The casual cruelty of it had made Grace's hands shake with anger. What kind of woman walked away from children like these? What kind of mother chose freedom over the two small hearts that beat in perfect rhythm with her own? But she also recognized the warning signs in James's behavior, the way he'd started avoiding family dinners, how he spoke to her with increasing formality, the careful distance he maintained whenever she was in the room. He was scared. She could see it in the tightness around his eyes, the way he clutched his phone like a lifeline. "He's not ready," she told herself firmly, "and neither are you." But late at night, when she passed his office and saw him still working, still punishing himself with isolation, her heart argued with her head. She'd catch herself wanting to bring him tea, to sit beside him and talk about something other than schedules and household management. She wanted to smooth the worry lines from his forehead, to tell him he was a better father than he believed. These thoughts kept her awake, staring at the ceiling of her comfortable guest suite and wondering when exactly she'd stop being just the housekeeper. The breaking point came on Friday evening. James had promised to attend Michael's school play, but a last-minute crisis with overseas investors had him trapped on conference calls. Grace watched from the kitchen as the boys waited by the front door in their good clothes, checking the driveway every few minutes. "Where is he?" Matthew asked, his voice small and brittle. "He'll be here," Michael insisted, but his confidence was cracking. "He promised." Grace felt something hot and protective rise in her chest. She'd seen too many children disappointed by adults who prioritized everything else over showing up. Her own father had been different, present, engaged, making their small farm feel like the center of the universe. These boys deserved that same certainty. She found James in his office, gesticulating at his computer screen, while men in expensive suits talked numbers that meant nothing to two 8-year-olds waiting for their father. "Excuse me," Grace said, not bothering to knock. James looked up, annoyed at the interruption. "Not now, Grace. This is important." "More important than your sons?" The words hung in the air like a slap. The men on the video call shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very interested in their own paperwork. "I'll call you back," James said curtly, ending the meeting. When he turned to face Grace, his expression was thunderous. "You forget yourself, Miss Chambers. My business obligations are what provide for this family." "Provide what?" Grace shot back, her Jamaican accent thickening with emotion. "Money? This big empty house? Those boys don't need another check, Mr. Wellington. They need their father. You don't understand the pressures." "I understand a broken promise to a child," Grace interrupted. "I understand 2 little boys sitting by that door, waiting for a man who's too busy counting his money to count his blessings." James stood, his jaw clenched. "You're out of line." "Yes," Grace said, lifting her chin. "I am. Because somebody needs to be. Those boys upstairs have already been abandoned by one parent. Don't make it 2. The silence stretched between them, charged with everything they weren't saying. James's hands trembled slightly, whether from anger or something else, Grace couldn't tell. Finally, he looked away. "The play started 20 minutes ago." "Then we better hurry," Grace said softly. But James shook his head, sinking back into his chair. It's too late. I've already let them down. Grace wanted to argue, to drag him bodily to that school if necessary. Instead, she watched him retreat behind his walls of guilt and self-loathing, and felt her own heart break a little for all of them. The emergency call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday. Grace jolted awake to the sound of her phone buzzing insistently against the nightstand. James's name flashed on the screen, and her heart immediately went to the worst places: accidents, hospitals, something terrible happening to the boys. "Hello," she whispered, already reaching for her robe. "Grace." James's voice was tight with panic. "I'm at Cedars-Sinai. Matthew's appendix. They're taking him into surgery. Michael's with me, but he's—" She could hear crying in the background, the kind of sobbing that came from deep terror. "Can you come? Please." She was dressed and out the door in 10 minutes. Grace found them in the pediatric waiting area, James pacing like a caged animal, while Michael curled in an oversized chair, his small body racked with sobs. The sight of them, so lost and frightened, made her chest ache. "Hey baby," she murmured, going straight to Michael. He launched himself into her arms without hesitation, clinging to her like she was his anchor in a storm. "They took Maddie away," he hiccuped against her shoulder. "The doctors took him, and he was crying and I couldn't help him." "Show love. The doctors are helping him feel better. That's their job." Grace's eyes met James's over Michael's head. He looked like he'd aged years in the space of hours. Hair disheveled, shirt wrinkled, his usually controlled expression raw with fear. "How long has he been in surgery?" she asked quietly. 3 hours. James's voice cracked slightly. "They said it was complicated. That it had almost burst." Grace felt Michael tense in her arms at his father's words. She rubbed soothing circles on his back while processing the implications. If Matthew's appendix had ruptured, if they'd waited much longer. "You did good calling for help when you did," she told James firmly. "You saved your son's life tonight." Something in James's face crumpled at her words. He sank into the chair beside them, finally allowing himself to show the terror he'd been carrying. "I almost didn't. He said his stomach hurt at dinner, but I thought he was just trying to get attention. After the school play thing, he's been—" James buried his face in his hands. "What kind of father am I?" "The kind who brought his son to the hospital at 3 in the morning, Grace said softly. "The kind who called me because he knew his boys needed comfort he wasn't sure how to give. That's not failing, James. That's love." The use of his first name hung in the air between them, an intimacy that crossed the careful professional lines they'd maintained. But in this sterile waiting room, with one child in surgery and another clinging to her like she was family, those boundaries seemed suddenly meaningless. "I can't lose him," James whispered. "I can't lose either of them. They're all I have left." Grace shifted Michael to one side and reached out without thinking, covering James's hand with hers. His fingers were ice cold, trembling with exhaustion and fear. "You won't. Matthew's strong. They both are. They get that from you." James looked up at her touch, his green eyes reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights. "You don't have to stay. This isn't part of your job description." "Maybe not," Grace said, her thumb unconsciously stroking across his knuckles. "But I'm staying anyway." The hours that followed blurred together in the strange intimacy that crisis creates. Grace made coffee runs and coaxed Michael to eat crackers from the vending machine. James called his assistant to cancel meetings, his voice hollow with exhaustion. They took turns walking Michael up and down the corridors when he got restless, their movements synchronized like they'd been doing this dance for years instead of weeks. Around dawn, Michael finally fell asleep curled between them on the uncomfortable waiting room couch. James's jacket covered the boy's small form, and Grace found herself studying the man beside her in the soft morning light filtering through the windows. "Tell me about Jamaica," James said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me what it was like before I came here?" Grace understood the question he couldn't quite ask. It was green. So green it hurts your eyes. My family had a small farm in the mountains, coffee beans and plantains, a few goats. My papa used to say the air tasted like dreams up there. Why did you leave? Grace was quiet for so long James thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of old grief. Drought took the crops. Then illness took my parents. The farm went to pay for medical bills that couldn't save them anyway. My sister Marva stayed to care for our grandmother, but someone had to come find work, send money home. So I came. Do you miss it? Home. Every day, Grace admitted. But missing something and regretting leaving it are different things. Sometimes you have to lose what you love to find what you need. James turned to look at her fully, this woman who'd somehow become essential to his family's survival. In the harsh hospital lighting, he could see the exhaustion in her face, the way she'd absorbed his children's pain and fear as if it were her own. She'd stayed through the longest night of his life, not because she had to, but because she chose to. Grace, he began, not sure what he wanted to say. Mr. Wellington? A doctor in scrubs appeared at the edge of their makeshift family huddle. Matthew's surgery went very well. He's asking for his daddy. The relief that flooded through James nearly knocked him over. But as they gathered their things to go see Matthew, Grace's hand still warm in his, he realized something had shifted in the space between crisis and dawn. Something that couldn't be easily explained away as gratitude or professional obligation. Something that felt dangerously like the beginning of love. Matthew's recovery kept them bound together in the house for the following week. Doctor's orders were strict, bed rest, light activities, and constant supervision. Grace moved through the days with quiet efficiency, managing medications and bland meals while the boys played board games and watched movies in Matthew's room. But it was the evenings that undid James completely. After the boys fell asleep, he and Grace would find themselves in the kitchen, sharing late dinners and conversations that stretched far beyond employer and employee. She told him about her grandmother's herb garden and the way Caribbean storms could turn the sky green. He found himself talking about his childhood in foster care, bouncing between homes until he learned that achievement was the only currency that mattered. "Is that why you work so much?" Grace asked one night, her fingers wrapped around a mug of the ginger tea she'd made for them both. "To prove you deserve to stay?" The question hit like a physical blow. James stared into his cup, watching steam rise between them. "Maybe. I've never thought about it that way. Children who grow up uncertain about love often spend their whole lives trying to earn what should be freely given," Grace said softly. "But your boys don't need you to earn their love, James. They need you to accept it." It was then, in that moment of painful honesty, that Michael appeared in the doorway. "Grace? Daddy?" "Matthew's asking for his mama." They found Matthew sitting up in bed, tears streaming down his pale cheeks. "I want mama," he whispered. "My tummy hurts and I want mama." James felt the familiar paralysis grip him. How do you explain abandonment to an 8-year-old? How do you tell a child that sometimes mothers just leave? But Grace sat on the edge of Matthew's bed and pulled him into her arms. "I know, baby. I know you miss her." "Why did she go away?" Matthew asked, his voice muffled against Grace's shoulder. "Was it because I'm bad?" "No," Grace said firmly. "Listen to me, love. You are not bad. Neither of you. Sometimes grown-ups make choices that have nothing to do with the children they leave behind. Your mama's leaving was about her heart, not yours." "But I miss her," Matthew sobbed. "Of course you do. Missing someone who's gone. That's love with nowhere to go. And love like that, it's precious. It means your heart works exactly the way it should." James watched from the doorway, his own eyes burning. Grace was giving his son something he'd never received himself. Permission to grieve, to feel abandoned, to still love someone who'd caused him pain. "Grace?" Matthew's voice was small. "Will you leave too?" Grace's hands stilled in Matthew's hair. James held his breath, waiting for the professional reassurance, the careful non-promise that employees were trained to give. Instead, Grace pulled back to look Matthew in the eye. "I will never leave you willingly," she said, her voice steady and sure. "As long as you want me here, as long as your daddy needs me here, I will stay. Promise?" "I promise." After Matthew fell back asleep, James found Grace on the back patio, staring up at the star-scattered sky. Her cheeks were wet with tears she hadn't let the boys see. "You shouldn't have promised him that," James said quietly, settling beside her on the porch swing. "Why not?" "Because you can't know what the future holds. Because promises like that get broken." Grace turned to face him, her dark eyes fierce in the moonlight. "Let me tell you something about promises, James Wellington. I grew up watching my parents keep theirs even when it was hard. When drought killed our crops, when sickness emptied our savings, when everything fell apart, they stayed. They kept their word to each other, to us children, to the life they'd built together. But they died," James said gently. "They left you anyway." Grace's breath caught, and for a moment, James thought he'd gone too far. But then she nodded slowly. "Yes, they died. And you know what I learned from that?" She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "That the only promises that matter are the ones you keep while you're alive. Every day I had with them was a kept promise. Every morning they woke up and chose us again as a victory against everything trying to tear us apart." She stood up, pacing to the edge of the patio. "After they died, I made a promise to my sister Marva, that I'd send money home, keep our family afloat somehow. So I came here, to this country that sees me as nothing but a pair of working hands. I've cleaned toilets and scrubbed floors and smiled while rich women complained about imaginary dust. I've sent every extra penny home while living in places barely fit for rats." Her voice broke slightly. "But I kept my promise. Even when I wanted to give up, even when I was so lonely I could barely breathe, I kept sending that money home. Because that's what love does. It keeps promises even when it hurts." James stood and moved toward her, drawn by the raw pain in her voice. "Grace, those boys in there," she continued, not turning around, "they've had enough broken promises for one lifetime. So yes, I promised Matthew I wouldn't leave willingly. And I meant every word. Because some promises are worth keeping, even if they cost you everything else." The silence stretched between them, filled with cricket songs and the distant hum of the city below. James wanted to reach for her, to offer comfort, to promise her that keeping her word wouldn't cost her everything. But the words stuck in his throat, tangled up with feelings he didn't know how to name. "The boys love you," he said finally. Grace finally turned to face him, and in her expression, he saw everything she wasn't saying. "I love them too. More than I expected. More than is probably wise." "And what about their father?" The question escaped before James could stop it, hanging in the air between them like a confession. Grace looked at him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face. "Their father," she said softly, "is the most complicated man I've ever met. Brilliant and broken, and so afraid of being hurt again that he keeps everyone at arm's length. Even the people who want nothing more than to love him." She stepped closer, and James caught the scent of her perfume, something warm and spicy that reminded him of sunshine and faraway places. "But yes," she whispered, "I love him too." The confession hung in the air between them like morning mist, beautiful, fragile, and impossible to take back. James felt his world tilt on its axis, everything he thought he knew about appropriate boundaries and professional relationships crumbling in the face of Grace's quiet honesty. "Grace," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. She stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself. "I shouldn't have said that. I'm sorry. I know this complicates things, and the boys don't need. Don't apologize." James moved closer, his voice urgent. "Please don't apologize for being the first honest thing in my life in years." She looked up at him then, and in her eyes, he saw his own wonder reflected back. How did this happen? When had the careful distance between them dissolved into something that felt essential as breathing? What are we doing, James? I don't know, he admitted. But I know I don't want to stop. They stood there in the moonlight, the space between them charged with possibility and fear. Finally, Grace smiled, not the polite, professional smile he'd grown used to, but something real and radiant that made his chest ache with want. The boys are going to wonder why we're both grinning like fools tomorrow, she said softly. Let them wonder, James replied, and for the first time in months he meant it. The next few days unfolded like a dream James was afraid to wake from. Nothing changed, and everything changed. Grace still managed the household with her usual efficiency, still helped the boys with homework and bandaged scraped knees. But now there were stolen glances across the breakfast table, fingers that lingered when passing dishes, conversations that hummed with new intimacy. James found himself coming home earlier, inventing reasons to spend time in whatever room Grace occupied. He'd watch her braid Matthew's hair before bed, marveling at the gentle patience in her fingers. He'd help her fold laundry, their hands brushing as they worked in comfortable silence. You know, Michael said one afternoon, looking up from his math homework, Grace makes you smile differently, Daddy. What do you mean, buddy? Before, when you smiled, it was just your mouth. Now it's your whole face. Out of the mouths of babes. James caught Grace's eye across the kitchen island, and she ducked her head, but not before he saw her own smile bloom. That evening, after the boys were asleep, James found Grace in the garden. She'd discovered his ex-wife's abandoned herb bed and had spent the last week coaxing life back into the neglected soil. She was kneeling among the plants, her hands dark with earth, humming that same melody he'd first heard in the kitchen. What's that song? He asked, settling beside her on the grass. Amazing Grace, she said, then laughed at his expression. Yes, I know. My mother had a sense of humor. She used to say I was her amazing grace, her gift from God after 3 miscarriages. Were you? A gift? Grace sat back on her heels, considering. I tried to be. I think that's why losing everything hurts so much. If I was supposed to be a gift, why couldn't I save them? Why couldn't I keep our family together? James reached out, covering her dirt-stained hands with his own. Maybe some gifts aren't meant to preserve the past. Maybe they're meant to create something new. She looked at him then, really looked, and he felt that familiar flutter of possibility in his chest. Is that what we're doing? Creating something new? I hope so. James brought her hand to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. God, I hope so. Grace's breath caught. James, are you sure about this? Really sure? Because I'm not just the housekeeper who's convenient and nearby. I'm a black woman from Jamaica who sends half her paycheck to family you'll never meet. I shop at thrift stores and speak patois when I'm tired and have opinions about everything from politics to the proper way to season rice. Good, James said simply. It's convenient. I've had it appropriate. I've had what looks perfect on paper and crumbles to nothing in real life. What I've never had is someone who makes my sons laugh every day and challenges me to be better than I thought possible. He shifted closer, cupping her face with his free hand. What I've never had is someone who sees past all the armor I've built and still chooses to stay. The world won't understand, Grace whispered. People will think you're having some kind of breakdown, that I'm taking advantage. The world can think whatever it wants, James interrupted. The only opinions that matter are in this house. Michael, Matthew, you and me. And from where I'm sitting, that's a pretty good majority. Grace laughed despite herself. You make it sound so simple. Maybe it is simple. Maybe we're the ones making it complicated. James leaned his forehead against hers. I love you, Grace. I love your strength and your kindness, and the way you brought music back into this house. I love that my sons trust you completely, and that you keep your promises even when they cost you everything. James, I love that you see me, not my bank account or my reputation, but me. The man who's terrified of failing his children, who works too much because he doesn't know how to just be present, who's been pretending to have his life together when really he's been drowning. Tears tracked down Grace's cheeks, catching the moonlight. "I love you too," she whispered. "I love how hard you try, even when you don't think it's enough. I love watching you with the boys, seeing you figure out how to be the father you never had. I love that you trusted me with your broken family and let me help put it back together." When he kissed her, it was soft and tentative at first, then deeper as she responded. She tasted like promise and new beginnings, like everything he'd been afraid to hope for. "So what now?" Grace asked when they finally broke apart. "Now," James said, pulling her close, "we figure it out together." The photograph arrived on a Thursday morning, slipped under the front door while James was getting the boys ready for school. Grace found it first, a glossy 8x10 image of her and James kissing in the garden, taken with a telephoto lens from some hidden vantage point. Attached was a note written in elegant script. "Some things never change. Call me Victoria." Grace's hands trembled as she stared at the image. Even in the grainy surveillance photo, the intimacy between them was undeniable. The way James held her face, the way she'd melted into his embrace, it looked exactly like what it was. Love. Real, complicated, inconvenient love. "Grace? What's wrong?" James appeared in the foyer, straightening his tie. The boys thundered down the stairs behind him, backpacks flying. She handed him the photograph without a word. James went rigid, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and finally cold fury. "Victoria." "Daddy." Michael tugged at his father's sleeve. "We're going to be late for school." "Get in the car," James said quietly, his voice deadly calm. "Grace will drive you today." "But..." "Now." The boys, sensing the sudden tension, grabbed their lunches and fled toward the garage. Grace started to follow, but James caught her arm. "Don't," he said. "Don't let her drag you into this. She's poison. She destroys everything she touches." "James, who took this picture? How did she?" "It doesn't matter. What matters is that she has it, and she'll use it." James ran a hand through his hair, the careful composure Grace had come to love fracturing before her eyes. "She'll use it to hurt the boys, to paint me as unstable, to what? Love someone? Be happy? To prove I'm unfit." The words came out raw, anguished. "Don't you see? A billionaire and his black housekeeper? The tabloids will have a field day. The custody case she never pursued will suddenly become front-page news. She'll claim I'm having some kind of breakdown, that I'm exposing our children to inappropriate relationships." "Inappropriate?" Grace's voice was ice. "Is that what this is to you? Inappropriate?" "No, that's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Grace stepped back, her dark eyes flashing with hurt and anger. "Because it sounds like you're ashamed of me. Of us. I'm trying to protect you." James exploded. "Do you have any idea what they'll do to you? The things they'll say? They'll tear apart your life, your family's life. They'll make you regret the day you walked into this house." Grace lifted her chin, every inch the proud woman who'd faced down poverty and loss and crossed an ocean for a better life. "Let me worry about what I can handle, James Wellington. I've survived things that would break men like you." The words hit like a slap. James stared at her, seeing for the first time the wall going up between them, brick by brick, hurt by hurt. "Men like me," he repeated quietly. "Men who think money can solve everything. Men who fold the moment things get difficult." Grace's voice was steady, but James could see the pain beneath her armor. "Men who make promises they never intended to keep. That's not fair, isn't it?" Grace pulled out her phone, scrolling to a text message. "Your ex-wife called 30 minutes ago. Left a voicemail about meeting for lunch to discuss your recent poor judgment regarding the children's welfare. She's already making her move, and you're already running scared." James felt the familiar panic rising in his chest, the same terror that had paralyzed him as a child bouncing between foster homes, never knowing when the next rejection would come. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. The responsibility. No, you don't understand, Grace interrupted. You think this is about money or reputation or what strangers might think. But it's not. It's about whether you believe love is worth fighting for. She moved toward the garage, then paused at the doorway. Those boys in there? They're watching how you handle the first real challenge to this family we've built. They're learning whether the people they love will stay and fight or cut and run when things get messy. Grace, wait. I need to get them to school, she said without turning around. And you need to decide what kind of man you want to be. The house felt like a tomb when Grace returned from dropping off the boys. James was in his office, door closed, the sound of his voice carrying through the walls as he made call after call. To lawyers, to PR firms, to crisis management specialists. Grace went to her room and began to pack. She moved methodically, folding clothes with the same precision she'd brought to every task in this house. Her few possessions looked pitiful in the expensive luggage James had bought for her last week, a gesture that had seemed sweet then and felt patronizing now. A soft knock interrupted her packing. Grace? Matthew's voice, small and worried. She opened the door to find both boys standing in the hallway, still in their school uniforms. They must have asked the driver to bring them home early. Are you leaving? Michael asked, his eyes red-rimmed. Grace's heart shattered. These beautiful boys, who'd already been abandoned by one parent, now faced losing another person they'd learned to trust. She knelt to their level, pulling them both into her arms. I don't want to, she whispered. But sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices. Because of the picture? Matthew's voice was barely audible. Because Daddy loves you? Grace closed her eyes, holding them tighter. How could she explain that their father's love might not be enough? That the world they lived in had rules that could tear apart the family they'd finally found? Because love is complicated, babies. And sometimes, no matter how much we want it to be, it's not enough to overcome everything else. But you promised, Michael said, pulling back to look at her with accusation in his young eyes. You promised you wouldn't leave willingly. The words cut deeper than any blade. Grace looked at these boys, her boys, in every way that mattered, and realized she was about to become just another adult who'd let them down. Sometimes, she said, her voice breaking, staying hurts the people you love more than leaving does. It was a lie, and they all knew it. But it was the only truth she could bear to speak. Grace sat in the Miami airport terminal, her boarding pass for Kingston clutched in her hands. Around her, families reunited with squeals of joy, while others said tearful goodbyes. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was running toward one family while abandoning another. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages she couldn't bring herself to read. The boys probably were wondering why she'd left while they were at school. James maybe, though she doubted he'd noticed her absence between his crisis management calls. She'd booked the first available flight home, using money she'd been saving for Marva's medical bills. Better to face poverty in Jamaica than watch the man she loved crumble under societal pressure. Better to leave on her own terms than wait for him to ask her to go. But as she stared at the departure board, Grace felt hollow, empty in a way she hadn't experienced since her parents died. Grace Chambers to the white courtesy phone. Grace Chambers. The announcement startled her from her spiral. Who even knew she was here? Reluctantly, she approached the courtesy phone desk. This is Grace Chambers. Grace. Marva's voice crackled through the international connection. Sister, what are you doing? I just got your message about coming home. Things didn't work out here. I'm coming back to help with Mama's bills. With what money? You said to yourself you spent your savings on this ticket. Grace closed her eyes. Trust Marva to cut straight to the logic. I'll figure something out. Grace Denise Chambers. Marva's voice turned stern, using her full name the way their mother had when they were children. I may be sick, but I'm not stupid. What happened to those boys you've been telling me about? The ones who call you their Grace. Grace's throat tightened. In her weekly calls home, she'd talked endlessly about Michael and Matthew, their laughs, their fears, their small triumphs. She'd painted pictures of their father too, though she'd been careful not to reveal her growing feelings. Their father, he has to choose between me and protecting them. And he's right to choose them. Is he? Marva's voice was sharp. Or is he choosing the easy way out? It's not that simple. Love never is, sister. But answer me this, do those boys love you? Yes, Grace whispered. And do you love them? More than my own life. Then why are you on a plane instead of fighting for your family? The word hit Grace like lightning. Family. That's what they'd become, hadn't they? Not through blood or marriage certificates, but through late-night fever watches and homework help and the 1,000 small moments that build a life together. Because I'm just the housekeeper, Marva. I'm not their mother. I'm not his wife. You're just the woman who put that family back together, Marva interrupted. The woman who taught those boys they were worthy of love. The woman who showed their father how to be present instead of perfect. Grace sank into a nearby chair, her boarding pass crumpling in her fist. Listen to me, Marva continued, her voice gentle now. Mama didn't raise us to run from love. She raised us to fight for it, especially when the world says we don't deserve it. But the scandal, the media, will pass. But regret? That lives forever. Marva paused. I'm not dying, Grace. The doctors found a treatment program. I wanted to surprise you, but I can't let you come home for the wrong reasons. What? The medical bills are manageable now. Government assistance, charitable programs will be fine. But you'll never forgive yourself if you walk away from this. Grace felt tears streaming down her cheeks. I'm scared, Marva. Good. Being scared means it matters. Meanwhile, James sat in his silent office, staring at the wall where Grace's laughter had once echoed. The crisis management team had left hours ago, their strategy clear. Distance himself from the situation, issue a statement about temporary household staff, wait for the news cycle to move on. Clean. Simple. Cowardly. His phone rang. Wellington. James. His lawyer's voice was tense. We have a problem. Victoria's filing for emergency custody. She's claiming you're mentally unstable, that you're exposing the children to inappropriate relationships. James closed his eyes. He'd seen this coming, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. What are our options? Honestly, the optics are bad. A recent divorce, a relationship with the help. Don't. James's voice was ice. Don't call her the help. I'm just saying how it looks to a judge. If you end the relationship now, make it clear it was a temporary lapse in judgment. James hung up. He found himself walking to Grace's room without conscious thought. The door stood open, revealing empty drawers and a stripped bed. On the nightstand sat a single piece of paper, her formal resignation, written in her careful script. Mr. Wellington, thank you for allowing me to care for your sons. They are extraordinary boys who deserve extraordinary love. I hope you find the courage to give it to them. Grace. James stared at the note until the words blurred. Around him, the house felt dead again, all marble and steel and echoing emptiness. In the space of 12 hours, he'd lost the woman he loved and sentenced his sons to another abandonment. A noise from the doorway made him look up. Michael and Matthew stood there in their pajamas, faces streaked with tears. We heard you on the phone, Michael said accusingly. You let her go. You promised you wouldn't let anyone else leave, Matthew added, his voice breaking. You promised. James knelt to their level, his own eyes burning. Boys, I was trying to protect. We don't want protection. Michael shouted. We want Grace. We want our family back. She made us happy, Matthew whispered. She made you happy. Why did you choose the mean people over us? The question hit James like a physical blow. Is that what he'd done? Chosen the approval of strangers over the love of his family? He looked at his sons, really looked, and saw the truth in their eyes. They weren't fragile things that needed protecting from love. They were warriors who'd already survived their mother's abandonment and come out stronger. They were brave enough to love again, to trust again. They were braver than their father. "You're right," James said quietly. "I chose wrong." "So fix it," Michael said simply. "Bring her home." James pulled his sons into his arms, breathing in their familiar scent of childhood and possibility. "What if it's too late?" "Grace says it's never too late to choose love," Matthew said. "She says love always wins if you're brave enough to fight for it. Smart woman, his Grace. Time to prove her right." James burst through the airport security checkpoint like a man possessed, his hastily purchased ticket clutched in one hand, his phone in the other. The boys ran beside him, their small legs pumping to keep up as they navigated the crowded terminal. "There!" Matthew pointed toward the departure gate. "Gate 47. They could see Grace through the window, sitting alone, her head bowed over something in her lap. James's chest constricted at the sight of her solitude, at how small she looked surrounded by strangers. "Excuse me," James gasped to the gate agent. "The woman sitting by the window, Grace Chambers. I need to speak with her before she boards." The agent looked at his expensive suit, at the two boys flanking him like bodyguards, at the desperation in his eyes. "Sir, boarding hasn't started yet, but—" "Please." The word came out raw. "I need to tell her I chose her. I choose them. I choose love." Something in his voice must have convinced her, because she gestured toward the seating area. "Go ahead." Grace looked up as their footsteps approached, her eyes widening in disbelief. "James? Boys, what are you?" "We came to bring you home," Michael announced, launching himself into her arms. "We don't care about stupid pictures," Matthew added, wrapping his arms around her waist. "We care about you." Grace's eyes filled with tears as she held them close. Over their heads, her gaze met James's. "How did you know I was here?" "I called every airline until I found your booking." James moved closer, his voice soft. "Grace, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I let fear make my choices instead of love." "James." "No, let me say this." He dropped to one knee beside her chair, taking her free hand while the boys settled protectively on either side of her. "I spent my whole childhood being thrown away by people who were supposed to love me. I learned that keeping everyone at arm's length was safer than risking that kind of pain again." His voice cracked slightly. "But you and the boys, you taught me that some things are worth the risk. That love isn't about safety or convenience or what looks good on paper. It's about showing up every day, even when it's hard. The media attention will be what it is," James said firmly. "Victoria can say whatever she wants. The truth is that you saved my family. You brought light back into our lives, taught my sons how to trust again, showed me how to be present instead of perfect. Any judge who can't see that isn't worth worrying about." Grace studied his face, searching for doubt. "And when society tells you that a billionaire shouldn't fall in love with his black housekeeper from Jamaica. When they say I'm after your money, will this never work?" James smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him since the photograph arrived. "Then I'll tell them they're right about one thing. This will never work as long as you're my housekeeper." Grace's breath caught. "What are you saying?" James reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. The boys gasped in delight as he opened it, revealing a vintage emerald ring surrounded by tiny diamonds. "I'm saying marry me, Grace Chambers. Not because it's convenient or expected, but because I can't imagine my life without your laugh in my kitchen, your wisdom guiding my sons, your love making me brave enough to be the man I want to be." "Daddy bought it at the airport jewelry store," Michael whispered conspiratorially. "He said he couldn't wait for perfection when love was right in front of him." Grace laughed through her tears, looking at this beautiful, complicated man kneeling before her in an airport terminal, surrounded by curious strangers and the two boys who'd stolen her heart from day one. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes." The gate area erupted in spontaneous applause as James slipped the ring onto her finger. Grace pulled him up for a kiss that tasted like second chances and new beginnings, while Michael and Matthew cheered loud enough to wake the dead. Flight 447 to Kingston, Jamaica, now boarding all passengers, the gate agent announced, but Grace was already standing, her boarding pass forgotten on the chair. "I guess I won't be needing this," she said, tearing the ticket in half. "Actually," James said, catching the pieces, "maybe we will. For our honeymoon. I'd like to see where you grew up, meet your sister properly, learn to make that jerk chicken recipe you won't share with me." Grace's smile could have powered the entire airport. "You want to go to Jamaica?" "I want to go everywhere with you," James said simply. "Jamaica, the blue mountains you told me about, anywhere you want to show me. I want to learn your world the way you learned ours." As they walked back through the terminal, James carrying Grace's luggage, the boys skipping ahead, Grace's hand warm in his, James felt something he'd never experienced before. Peace. Not the brittle control he'd mistaken for peace, but the deep, abiding calm that comes from being exactly where you belong. "Mr. Wellington?" A reporter materialized beside them, camera crew in tow. "Care to comment on your relationship with your former employee?" James stopped walking, his jaw tensing. But before he could speak, Grace squeezed his hand. "She's not my former employee," James said clearly, his voice carrying through the terminal. "She's my fiancée, the woman I love, the future Mrs. Wellington. And if you want to comment about that, here it is. I'm the luckiest man alive." The reporter looked taken aback by his directness. "But sir, the optics—" "The optics," Grace interrupted, her Jamaican accent rich with pride, "are of a family who chooses love over fear. If that's not beautiful to you, then you're looking with the wrong eyes." James stared at her in admiration. This woman, his woman, faced down the world with such grace and dignity that even the cynical reporter seemed momentarily speechless. 6 months later, James stood in the garden where they'd first kissed, watching Grace walk down an aisle lined with white roses and their closest friends. Michael and Matthew served as ring bearers, beaming with pride as they helped their father marry the woman who'd become their mother in every way that mattered. Victoria had dropped her custody suit after James's public declaration went viral, turning him from scandal to love story overnight. Turns out, the world was hungrier for authentic love than manufactured controversy. As Grace reached him, radiant in ivory silk and her grandmother's pearls, James thought about the divorce papers that had started this journey. His ex-wife had been right about one thing: they were irreconcilable. What she hadn't understood was that sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of a better one. "Ready?" Grace whispered as they joined hands. "For anything," James replied, "as long as it's with you." And as they spoke their vows under the California sun, surrounded by the family they'd built from heartbreak and hope, Grace thought about her grandmother's words. Every morning is a chance to start fresh, like the sun rising over the blue mountains. Today felt like the most beautiful sunrise of her life. What can we learn about the courage it takes to choose love over fear, especially when the world says your love doesn't fit their expectations?